Two violinists who died in plane crashes. Another slightly macabre video in a way, or tragic video for sure. But these are often the stories that we're interested in, and also it concerns two violinists who were two of the greats of the 20th century. One whose full potential sadly was not realised, but who nevertheless goes down as one of the greats, and the other who lived a longer life and definitely is one of the legends of the 20th century. So let's start off with Ginette Neveu. She was born in 1919 and died tragically in 1949 at the age of 30 in a plane crash. We could summarise it this way: the power and passion of the remarkable French virtuoso whose career was cut short in its prime. Let's look at the chronology of Neveu's life. In 1919 she was born in Paris. In 1933 made her official Paris debut. In 1935 came first in the first International Wieniawski competition, so she won first prize ahead of David Oistrakh, who came second. 1937 marked her US debut, and 1945 her London debut. Then in 1949, tragically, she was killed in an air crash, aged just 30. Now let's look at Ginette Neveu's early life. Neveu was by all accounts a child prodigy and was already playing by the age of 5. Her first teacher was her mother, an accomplished player in her own right. She was sent to the class of Line Taluel and aged only 7 performed the Bruck First Concerto with the Cologne Orchestra at the Salle Gaveau in Paris. 2 years later she won a prize from the city for a performance of the Mendelssohn E minor concerto and went on to win the Paris Conservatoire's violin prize. After only 8 months at the institution, she was still only 11. Wow. So at the Paris Conservatoire, she studied with Jules Boucherie, and she studied composition with Nadine Boulanger, the great teacher of composition in France. She continued her studies first with George Enescu, and then, having been talent spotted at the Vienna International Violin Competition, spent 4 years studying with Carl Flesch. Flesch offered to teach her without charge after hearing her at the Vienna International Violin Competition, at which, age 12, she was placed 4th out of 250 entrants. To quote Carl Flesch, this is what he said: "My child, you have received a gift from heaven and I have no wish to touch it. All I can do for you is to give you some purely technical advice." That's similar like with Leopold Auer with his students. He couldn't really teach them much in the way of technique. Indeed, many of them surpassed his own technique, but it was more interpretation and maturity, musical maturity, that these great pedagogues imparted to these already born talented players, prodigies, in some cases geniuses. Her brother Jean-Paul became a classical pianist and her eventual accompanist. The composer and organist Charles-Marie Widor, or Widor maybe, written with a W, was their great uncle. Beginning of fame. In 1933, the Strad wrote that the little girl, she was now 13, played music by Mozart, Brahms, Pugnani and Moszkowski and Ravel Zigan in a manner which experienced performers might have envied. This gifted child should go far. As we mentioned, Neveu also studied with the revered composition teacher Nadia Boulanger, and Carl Flesch actually encouraged Neveu to include some of her own music compositions in recitals. Then 2 years later, from 1933 and 1935, of course, she beat David Oistrakh into second place at the first International Wieniawski competition in Warsaw, and tours of Poland and Germany followed with a US debut in 1937. Whether or not she was worthy of the first prize in the first Wieniawski competition is a matter of controversy. Some feel that probably David Oistrakh should have won that, but there was apparently an anti-Semitic climate, dark shadow of anti-Semitism overshadowing that competition. Still, David Oistrakh made it to second despite that. But maybe she was worthy of the first prize. The Second World War inevitably interrupted her career. She didn't make her London debut until March 1945. During the war, she gave few concerts, nearly all of them in France. Now, this is an interesting point. Many invitations to play in Germany were turned down. I should have included her in the video I made about musicians and composers in the Third Reich. So that is one noteworthy moral stand that she must have taken. She turned down any opportunity to perform in Germany. She effectively decamped to Britain for much of the 1946 to 47 season, and also toured to North and South America in the post-war years. On to the topic of Ginette Neveu and the composer Francis Poulenc, the French composer. She did have the chance to request a sonata from Francis Poulenc, who would later relate, "To be honest, I didn't like the violin as a solo instrument, but how could I resist a suggestion from Ginette Neveu? The war had deprived us of Menuhin, Heifetz and Francescatti, but we had the unexpected fortune to have their equal on our doorstep." There are some tasty details in the violin part, entirely due to Ginette Neveu, who was a great help over the instrumental writing. No doubt her studies of composition with Nadine Boulanger again helped, as she advised the composer. The two premiered the sonata in June 1943. Ginette Neveu was said to have a masculine sound. According to Strad magazine, even Ida Handel, interviewed by the Strad's editor, used the word masculine to describe Neveu's sound. Added to her statuesque figure and her deep speaking voice, it's not impossible to believe suggestions made by some that she was intersex, or in older terminology, a hermaphrodite. I don't know about that. Either way, there is no denying that her sound and playing were muscular. And a tantalising snippet of her playing the Chanson Poème on YouTube shows her well-developed bow arm and the energy she brings to its use. I'll give you the reference in the description box. So she wasn't a feminine style player, quite the opposite. The Vienna Neues Tageblatt wrote, "If you close your eyes, you think you are listening to the vigorous playing of a man and not that of a little girl in a white frock." The sound of Ginette Neveu, she always gave the impression of inhabiting the music she was playing through her whole being, which gave her such magnetic presence on stage. This was a quote from the Strad again, I think. Let's just look at the Wieniawski competition and glance over the prize winners. Obviously Ginette Neveu and David Oistrakh stand out. Ida Handel only 7th. I wonder why. Maybe she still had to develop somewhat. I would have said she should have been 3rd. Let's talk some more about this famous Wieniawski competition, the first competition, and the aftermath for Ginette Neveu. Unable to afford the cost of travel to Warsaw, the family was helped by Carl Flesch, who paid for the trip. Neveu was placed first, 26 points ahead of David Oistrakh, and in the final, again, she came in first. She was 15, Oistrakh was 27 at the time. The 15-year-old Neveu wooing the audience, especially with her rendition of Ravel's Zigan. So a Gallic or French piece, I guess fit like hand in glove for Neveu, being a French player. She was able to interpret that in a way that won over the judges comprehensively. Neveu was immediately signed to an extensive touring contract, which over the next 2 years saw her give solo performances at the leading concert halls of Germany, Poland, the Soviet Union, the United States and Canada. Let's talk a bit about the instruments of Ginette Neveu. Early on, she owned a Nicolas Lupeault violin of unknown year. It's a wonderful violin, by the way. If you go to the Ashmolean, you'll see a fine example of a decorated Nicolas Lupeault violin in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. See my video on Oxford Violin Pilgrimage if you want to see what that looks like. But then, as if that wasn't a fine enough fiddle, in 1935 she bought a 1730 Omobono Stradivari to play at Wieniawski's competition. Obviously Omobono, the son of the great Antonio Stradivari. So she owned a violin by Omobono. This violin was to meet a sad end, as we'll later see. She later supplemented it with a GB Guadagnini. They say that GB Guadagnini is the number 3 violin. Strad, Del Gesù and Guadagnini in terms of quality. Strad and Del Gesù, debatable. Some people would say, well, let's just put them in joint first, shall we? And Guadagnini then would be the second most wonderful violin maker ever, according to some. Some might actually say that Carlo Bergonzi could vie for that 3rd place. Who knows? That's maybe a matter of opinion. In terms of bows, she had a Hill & Sons, Fleur de Lis and Chardon bows. A little more on Ginette Neveu's performance style. Wrote the critic of the New York Telegram, Ginette Neveu is an impressive figure, tall, dark, with an imposing manner. Whenever there is a rest for the violin, she stands like an acolyte, robed in white, her eyes fixed on the conductor. It is fascinating. I think you see a bit of that in the Chanson Poème, I believe. That is actually on film on YouTube, that performance. Now we come on to the sad part, her tragic death. The French violinist Ginette Neveu was 30 when her plane crashed in the Azores. So the Hill & Sons Fleur de Lis and Chardon bows were recovered in her double case after the plane crash. Both instruments were presumed destroyed. So it's strange, isn't it, how they managed to recover the bows but not the instruments. Although the Guadagnini scroll later surfaced in Paris. I wonder what violin that now, composite violin that now belongs to. Legends still circulate about Neveu being found in the wreckage with the crushed Stradivari clutched in her arms, contradicted by others that claim a local Azorean fiddler was later to be heard playing on the remarkable instrument. Well, if that's true, then maybe the instrument still survives, but it's unlikely, I think. And here we see Ginette Neveu's grave in the Père Lachaise Cemetery, Paris, in the Division 11, 11th division of the Père Lachaise ginormous cemetery in Paris, very close to the grave of Frédéric Chopin. So the 11th division is where all the musicians are buried in Père Lachaise. And as I'm going to Paris for a violin pilgrimage, I'm going to the Cité de la Musique later in the year, I started doing a bit of research about how on earth you would find the grave in Père Lachaise. Watch this space for some 5-6 months from now. I'll hopefully have a video of me in the cemetery at the graveside. But anyway, here's some information on how you can locate Ginette Neveu's grave should you ever be passing through Paris and wish to find it in the Père Lachaise cemetery. I believe you can also take an organised tour of a couple of hours through the cemetery. Obviously, while you're there, you might as well go and see Oscar Wilde, Chopin and Jim Morrison's tombs. There's others of many famous people there, of course. Some images of the plane crash now. First of all, the type of plane seems quite advanced for 1949, although obviously it's still a propeller aeroplane. This is her getting on board the plane before the crash, and some photos of the crash, and a plaque which I think is on the hillside in the Azores. This is her shortly before that tragic flight. Details of her death and fellow passengers. She revisited America on January 1949, was scheduled to fly to New York again in late October. On the 27th, she and Jean arrived at Orly Airport ready to board the Lockheed Constellation airplane known as the Airplane of the Stars. In the departure lounge they met fellow passenger Marcel Cerdan, the North African boxer known as the Casablanca Clouter. Casablanca Clouter, then in a relationship with chanteuse Edith Piaf, who, as it happens, is also buried in the Père Lachaise. That's one of the famous tombs you can find there, Edith Piaf. A French tabloid photographer was there too, and in a high-spirited photo shoot, Cerdan posed holding Ginette's Stradivarius. Things took a less happy turn at 2 the following morning, when the plane attempting to land for refueling the Azores crashed, killing all 48 on board. I wonder if it's 2 in the morning, maybe she was fast asleep and didn't know what happened, so to speak. I hope so. A horrible way to die. Ginette, Strad and Guadagnini were also destroyed. The crash and the lives of the passengers are imagined in Adrien Bosch's award-winning 2014 novel Constellation. That could make an interesting read, that book. Some honours that Ginette Neveu received. She was posthumously awarded the Cross of the Légion d'Honneur. A street is named in her memory in the Montmartre region of Paris. Again, hopefully I can go and see that when I do my violin pilgrimage at the Cité de la Musique and I'm in Paris. It'd be nice. I'm just conscious that I might be taking on a bit too much on that trip. It's just a short trip to Paris, but we'll see. Music critics, a 1947 Carnegie Hall recital. So how many years is that after Heifetz? 30 years after Heifetz's 1917 debut. Composer, critic Virgil Thomson, I think he was not very kind to Heifetz. Was it Virgil Thomson? I would have to make sure I'm not mixing up with the other kind of idiot music critic who spoke of Heifetz as having like his sound like silken underwear. Just a jealous guy. Anyway, I don't know if this was the same one. I'll double check. But he had certainly a glowing review for Ginette Neveu, calling her the finest from every point of view of the younger European artists. She is an interesting artist because she has rhythm and a special intensity all her own. Tributes. After Neveu's death, tributes poured in. The Queen of Belgium visited the grieving family who had lost both a son and a daughter. The composer, Francis Poulenc, whose violin sonata Neveu had premiered and parts of which she had contributed, wrote, "I'm haunted by the memory of Ginette Neveu. I had the greatest admiration for her and I loved her dearly." For Pablo Casals, her playing was one of the greatest revelations, both instrumental and musical, to the impression of perfection, balance and artistic taste. She added in her interpretation fire and abandon, which filled her playing with richness. It's wonderful stringing together of words. Charles Munch, who actually conducted Heifetz in violin concertos. The newly installed conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, who had often worked with her, wrote, "Dear Ginette, the memory of you will never cease to haunt us, and each time that by the grace of God we are able to make music really well, we shall feel you very close to us." Jacques Thibaud, we'll come on to him in a moment, the great French violinist who would himself die in a plane crash shortly afterward, wrote, "Why was it that at the dawn of her days an unjust and relentless stroke of fate should come and cut off a life which was bringing to the world nothing but beauty and joy? But in spite of the sternness of destiny in the hearts of her friends and of the whole world, Ginette is unforgettable. The memory of her will never die. Conductor Eugene Ormandy called her the greatest woman violinist. Would you agree? Because of course we have Ida Handel and others whose career went on for much longer. And I'll go so far as to say one of the greatest interpreters on the violin of our time. It must have no doubt been an advantage for her to have studied composition as well as studied violin. Ended recordings of Ginette Neveu. Let's single this one out. The most highly praised and revelatory was her Sibelius with the Philharmonia Orchestra and Walter Susskind. Of it, the composer Sibelius wrote, "I particularly wish to speak of my feeling of profound gratitude when I think of the inspired and extremely sensitive performance of my violin concerto, which Ginette Neveu rendered unforgettable." What's your definitive recording of the Sibelius? For me, it's Heifetz, the second recording. Both the Heifetz ones are amazing. Some might say that the definitive version belongs to Ginette Neveu. I wonder what you think about that. And here's a link for some additional recordings. See the description box below. You see, the death of Ginette Neveu was one of the great tragedies in violin history. The French violinist was 30 and still a rising star when the Air France flight on which she was travelling crashed into the mountain in the Azores archipelago. Upon her death, the music world responded with grief-stricken testimonials. By all accounts, Neveu was an extraordinary, charismatic performer, possessed of incredible interpretive conviction. She could make long stretches of music feel like one unending phase, and produced a tone of great depth, coloured with a distinctive vibrato, which, in her recordings, is especially present in smaller scale repertoire. She was also a sensitive and creative colourist and used slides to great effect for changes of colour and momentum. That's quoting Strings magazine. Of course, she came after Heifetz, so she was no doubt riding on the glissando that Heifetz established, the new modern style of glissando. I must listen to a few more of her recordings in greater depth to capture the nuances of her glissando, but her vibrato has been singled out as being especially beautiful. That was Ginette Neveu. Now we come on to another of the greats of the 20th century who also died in a plane crash. Another French player, Jacques Thibaud. Born on the 27th of September 1880, died tragically on the 1st of September 1953. This is Jacques Thibaud's biography. He was born in Bordeaux, studied the violin with his father before entering the Paris Conservatoire at the age of 13. He studied with Martin Marsic at the Paris Conservatoire and was awarded first prize in 1896. In 1896, he jointly won the Conservatory's violin prize with Pierre Monteux, so joint first prize with Pierre Monteux, who later became a famous conductor. Engaged by Edouard Colonne, he was quickly promoted to concertmaster and took Guillaume Remy's place in the Prelude to Deluge by Saint-Saëns. This marked the beginning of a solo career in which chamber music was crucial. In 1905, he founded a trio with Pablo Casals and Alfred Cortot that would become one of the most influential chamber music ensembles of the 20th century. I did talk about Alfred Cortot in my Musicians During the Third Reich video. Controversial character, should we say, in that time period, but gifted pianist. So the reason why at 18 Thibaud was playing in the Paris Cologne Orchestra was that the concertmaster fell ill. So Thibaud took his place. Young Jacques filled in on the solos for Saint-Saëns Le Déluge, creating a phenomenal sensation. He ended up soloing with the orchestra 54 times that season. In the next few years, Thibaud made debuts in London, Berlin, New York. For the ensuing several decades, he was considered the French violinist. Let's talk about his performance career. Thibaud was noted not only for his work as a soloist, but also for his performances of chamber music, particularly in the piano trio with Cortot and Casals. He undertook concert tours with pianist Yves Nat and Georges Enescu. He was a friend of the violinist Eugène Ysaÿe, who dedicated his second sonata for solo violin to him. Eugène Ysaÿe's advice helped him turn his attention to teaching after World War I when Cortot established the École Normale de Musique de Paris. He had to rebuild his technique after being injured in World War I. In 1943, he and Marguerite Long established the Marguerite Long Jacques Thibaud International Competition for Violinists and Pianists, which takes place each year in Paris. From 2011, it included singers and is now known as the Long Thibaud Crespin competition in honour of the soprano Régine Crespin. Among his students were Manuel Quiroga, the dedicatee of Ysaÿe's sixth solo sonata, Eric Rosenblit, Joan Field, Rachel Steinman-Clark, Stefan Hero, and Ephraim Neiman. May not have pronounced all those names spot on. A note on Jacques Thibaud's playing style. On record, Thibaud's intonation is pleasantly bright. His slides are of varied speed and frequent. He's always ready to play a more difficult fingering to accommodate a slide. It must more probably old style slide, pre-Heifetz slide, glissando style, because he's older than Heifetz by some few decades. Though not a technician per se, he plays blazingly fast at times. His pizzicato is unusually expressive, his phrasing full of interior dynamics, and his performances full of constant moment-to-moment music making. In fact, his recordings feel live. Interesting. Now we come on to the tragic death of Jacques Thibaud. On the 1st of September 1953, Jacques Thibaud tragically died in the crash of Air France Flight 178, along with all 41 other passengers. Just like Ginette Neveu, the entire plane, everyone on the plane was wiped out. The aircraft, registered as FBAZZ, was on its final approach to Nice when it struck Mount Cimer in the French Alps. Thibaud was travelling to a performance in Tokyo, and his prized 1720 Stradivarius violin was destroyed in the crash. This is not just a tragedy, a human tragedy, it's an artistic loss of fabulous works of art. Two Stradivarius violins, father and son, examples, destroyed. The accident investigation established controlled flight into terrain, CFIT, as the cause. The tragedy gets greater when you consider that his wife and accompanist also perished. 42 victims. 42 in total. Thibaud plus 41 others, including René Herbin, his accompanist, and Madame Roger Thibaud. Some photos to show on that. And a chronology, there's too much to go through here, but I'll just highlight some salient milestones in the life of this great violinist. I'll drop a link in the description box of some more interesting pictures of the crash. Recordings. Thibaud suffered from terrible nerves. So some of these violinists are only human after all. He reported having had several crying fits the day of his Deluge debut, and his playing declined considerably in later years. We have to remember he was injured in the First World War. Flesch believed he had to be heard in the flesh, no pun intended, I'm sure, in order to be fully appreciated. Nonetheless, many great Thibaud recordings exist exhibiting his fascinating style. Thibaud was a sparkling Mozart player, very good at interpreting Mozart. His recording of the Fauré is gorgeously melodic. In the finale of the Debussy, he finds expression in the scalar writing that many other interpreters overlook. His Beethoven Archduke, Schubert B flat, D898, Mendelssohn D minor and Schumann D minor chamber works are also uniformly magnificent. Among Thibaud's repertoire favourites were spicy numbers such as the Lalo Symphony Espagnole, the Havanaise by Saint-Saëns, French, Spanish kind of, he had a feel for that. Legacy of Jacques Thibaud. For the first half of the 20th century, the Frenchman Jacques Thibaud 1880 to 1953, so he was 21 years older than Heifetz, I guess, was one of the world's most beloved soloists. He was a performer of unique and special gifts. "I pity all young violinists," said his friend George Enescu, "who have not heard Thibaud. In their book of memories, an irreplaceable image is lacking." When he first heard Thibaud's playing, Enescu recalled, "It took my breath away. I was beside myself with enthusiasm. It was so new, so unusual, so refreshing sound." Carl Flesch spoke about Thibaud's tone and said, it fascinated the listener by its sweet and seductive colour, literally unheard of at the time. Some great depth in his playing. In fact, Thibaud, with this gorgeous vibrato and array of deeply expressive slides, joined Fritz Kreisler at the century's outset in giving the world a newly sensuous ideal of violin tone. Kreisler is said to have called Thibaud the greatest violinist in the world, while Eugène Issai proclaimed, "There are two violinists from whose playing I can always be certain of learning something, Kreisler and Thibaud." American violinist Albert Spaulding recalled that he could tell tales with enthralling zest. That's such an important point there, that when in your playing you're trying to tell a story. You're trying to say something, and Thibaud was a past master at that. The same grace and charm that individualised his playing was evident in everything else he undertook. So, a man of style who no doubt spurned mediocrity just like Heifetz. He was irresistible to women, young and old, and was as proud of this power as he was modest about his musical genius. I don't know if he was a womanizer, but he seemed to enjoy the attention, at the very least. According to Pablo Casals, with whom he played as a superstar piano trio along with Alfred Cortot, Thibaud hated work, rarely practiced, and had no sense of responsibility. Very honest of appraisal from Cortot. He often behaved like a child, a naughty child, but he was wonderfully witty and gay, using that word to mean happy in the old-fashioned sense. He loved practical jokes and had a remarkable inventiveness for them. For David Oistrakh, Thibaud was not only an inspired artist, he was a man of crystalline honesty, quick-witted, charming, a real Frenchman. His performance was of heartfelt sincerity, optimistic in the best sense of the word. Now I'd like to come on to Jacques Thibaud's instruments. From AI Google search, it's coming back with the 1716 Colossus Stradivari stolen in 1998. The 1709 Bayeux Stradivari, Thibaud's wedding gift from his father-in-law, presumed destroyed in the plane crash that killed him. 1714 Beroux Stradivari, owned by Thibaud. Other violins included a 1723 Carlo Bergonzi, owned by Thibaud, and a 1788 Pic, previously owned by Issai. I had a tourte bow, the Bayeux, presumed destroyed in the air crash, and the tourte bow was a wedding present from his father-in-law. What a fantastic wedding present. A link to this Strad article detailing the instruments of Thibaud. Two tragic stories of two wonderful violinists of the 20th century, one whose life was definitely cut short before her time, before she should have died, really. The other one lived a full life, but still a great loss. So another story of tragedy, but great to remember these two fine violinists. I'll finish by just checking, as I always like to do, what the great Henry Roth has to say about these two violinists. So Henry Roth dedicates an entire chapter to Jacques Thibaud, and he starts the chapter by saying, "Those who insist that the element of charm is a vital component in the realm of violinistic communication will always cherish the artistry of one of its foremost purveyors, Jacques Thibaud." And precisely what is the literal definition of charm? According to Webster, it means to attract irresistibly, to delight exceedingly, to enchant, fascinate, bewitch, as sounds that charm the ear. Though many observers may hold that charm in violin playing is fast becoming an anachronism in our time, more than any other single word it describes the cardinal feature of Thibaud's muse. I did detail that where he died was in a place called Mount Cernay, near Barcelonnette, France. Aside from his compelling talents as a violinist and musician, Thibaud's charm extended to his person and became the intimate of many of the supreme artists of his day. It has a smaller section dedicated to Ginette Neveu on page 317 under the chapter Women and the Violin. Since the advent of Marini, one of the most spectacular women violinist talents to emerge was Ginette Neveu, whose career was tragically cut short at the age of 30. A flesh pupil, Neveu had scarcely attained full artistic maturity at the time of her demise, so she had much more to give, according to Roth. She was a supreme colourist, as opposed to a host of outstanding violinists who may possess beauty of sound, but whose tonal projection and vibrato are essentially one-dimensional. Not true of Neveu. Neveu was a painter of exquisite musical soundscapes.